Workers in the public sector will earn 11% or more on average than those in the private sector after Philip Hammond signaled the end of the government's pay cap. The Institute for Fiscal Studies said that even after years of pay restraint, workers employed by the state now earn almost 13% or more on average per hour compared with private sector staff. If the public sector pay cap remained in place, this would have fallen to around 7% or by 2020/21. But after the budget spelled the end for the cap, which has limited annual pay rises to 1% or for the past 6 years, the difference will settle at around 11% or the IF's forecast. Workers in the public sector will earn 11% or more on average than those in the private sector after Philip Hammond signaled the end of the government's pay cap. The figures do not take into account that the public sector benefits from gold-plated final salary pensions, which are now virtually unheard of in the private sector. The higher wages are expected to cost the taxpayer £2.8 billion a year in 2020. Of this, £900 million will go towards the NHS and £800 million to schools, with £1.1 billion to other public sector workers, the IF said. The analysis casts doubt on claims that austerity is causing widespread hardship for state workers. Related articles previous. 1 Next. Why downbeat productivity figures are just plain wrong. Bishop says budget did too little on affordable housing. Share this article. Share script dm.later, bundle, function, if, dm.rotator, new dm.rotator, p20, pages i.es, 1, page count, 1.0, active class, active, rotate, false, $, number p20.share, .on, click, function, dms.facebook.post.If, related. The forecast, unveiled at a conference in London yesterday, is based on the assumption that public sector pay will start to rise at around the same level as private sector pay. Carl Emerson, deputy director of the IFs, said pay restraint had brought the wage gap back to where it was before the recession. On average, public sector workers get paid more per hour than private sector workers, he said. That's not surprising, they have on average higher levels of education. So, for example, you would expect a surgeon to get paid more than the average private sector worker. The figures do not take into account that the public sector benefits from gold-plated final salary pensions, which are now virtually unheard of in the private sector. 2 decades with no real growth in pay. Britain faces almost 2 decades without earnings growth, while the national debt will not be under control for another 50 years, according to a bleak assessment yesterday. The Institute for Fiscal Studies said it was truly astonishing that average earnings would still be below their 2008 level, in real terms, in 2022. And it said the net national debt may not fall to its pre-crisis levels of 40% of national income until well past the 2060s. It currently stands at 86%. The IFs based its projections on figures in Wednesday's budget. The forecasters' director Paul Johnson said they made grim reading, adding, "Despite all the gloom, we may hope for better, though we may still fear for worse." The think tank also said Philip Hammond's budget suggested the end of austerity was still a long way off. It said public services outside the NHS were facing further spending cuts of 7% in the next 5 years. Forecasts from the Office for Budget Responsibility suggest GDP per head will be 3.5% lower in 2021 than was forecast 2 years ago. This will equate to a £65 billion hit to the economy, Mr. Johnson said. Average earnings in 2021 look set to be nearly £1,400 lower than forecast in March 2016, lower in real terms than in 2008. He added, "We are in danger of losing not just 1 but getting on for 2 decades of earnings growth." The UK's growth is predicted to be well behind the other G7 advanced economies. The OBR said it may not exceed 1.6% in the next 5 years. The IFs said this means Mr. Hammond's desire to hit his target to balance Britain's books in the 2020s looks remote. Mr. Johnson said meeting the target would require cuts worth another £20 billion. Responding to the IFs, a government spokesman said, "The budget set out the next steps in our plan to build an economy that is fit for the future, deliver the homes our country needs and support families and businesses. Public sector pay restraint since 2010 has brought this ratio back to pre-crisis levels. It's unwound the unintended increase in public sector pay relative to private sector pay that occurred during the Great Recession. At one point, in 2011-12, public sector wages were 18% or more than the private sector's. But Mr. Emerson said with the pay cap in place, Britain would have seen the ratio fall below anything we've seen for the last 20 years, adding, clearly, this would risk problems of recruitment and retention in the public sector and make it increasingly difficult for the government to deliver the public services that it wants. He said that has now changed after the Chancellor promised a Treasury-funded pay rise for some health workers, raising expectations that the public sector will also benefit and prompting the Office for Budget Responsibility to raise its forecast for wage growth for state workers. Unions had welcomed Mr. Hammond's commitment to cover the cost of higher public sector wages in his budget speech. If that money's spent well, recruitment and retention problems might remain around their current levels, Mr. Emerson said. This is all good news, but the difficult thing is it costs money, an extra £2.8 billion in 2020-21. The question is, will the extra funds come from the Treasury or will the public sector employers have to find them from their existing budgets? The wage comparison is based on a crude measure of average hourly wages for the 5.1 million people working in the public sector, and the 26 million in the private sector. The public sector tends to be more highly educated, whereas there are more lower-paid workers on the minimum wage in the private sector. The pay gap was last as low as 11% in 2001-02. It was just over 12% in 2007-08 when the financial crisis hit. This caused a collapse of average wages in the private sector while public sector wages were protected, causing the gap to widen. Chloe Wesley, of the Taxpayers Alliance, said last night, "Taxpayers are grateful to public sector workers and expect them to be paid fairly." Unions had welcomed Mr. Hammond's commitment to cover the cost of higher public sector wages in his budget speech. However, too often we forget that most people who work in the private sector and whose taxes pay for the salaries of public sector workers haven't seen a pay increase in years. The government should give everyone, in all sectors, a break by cutting taxes, and allow people to keep more of the money they earn so they can provide for their family and save.